Is that it?
It's on.
Okay. All right, so tonight I wanted to look at the book of Jonah, and I wanted to look at the gospel according to the book of Jonah. And so kind of in my preparation for this project, I've done research on the book of Jonah, both historically and literary context. I have looked at a passage in Luke, the prodigal son story, the older brother, and looked at connections between the older brother and Jonah. And so we'll look at some of that application, and then we're going to do a few group projects at the end to kind of pull it all together. And so we'll be looking primarily at Jonah chapter 3. Verse 10 through chapter 4, verse 3. And eventually, in the second objective, we'll look at tying it to Luke 15. Specifically, 25 through 31. And so, like I said, I just kind of want to give us what are our learning objectives tonight. What are we gonna try to accomplish? First, we're going to try to accomplish studying together through the book, and we're going to look at authorship, date, and historical and literary context. And then we will dive into making a connection between Old and New Testament by looking at Jonah and the older brother in the prodigal son story. Then we'll attempt to reflect on Jonah and the older brother's tendencies and allow the gospel to transform our hearts through the process. And then finally, we will reflect on God's heart for the people, the Ninevites and the older and younger brother, and we'll apply these truths by examining them side by side with our own hearts. And then hopefully at the end the gospel is transformed us. So let's jump into objective A, where we kind of look at just studying together. This is kind of the research part of it. So first, let's look at authorship of Jonah. Just kind of look at some of the details here. We know that Jonah was written in third person, and so it's pretty clear that somebody is writing what Jonah is conveying, but we don't know for a fact that Jonah was actually the author. It's a pretty good possibility, but it never comes right out and says, I, Jonah, or in another book, Jonah wrote Jonah. And so we don't know that for sure, but it's pretty clear that either Jonah wrote it, and more likely that Jonah is conveying the truth of what happened, and somebody else is recording it for him. The date of the book of Jonah, as my board falls off, Jonah lived somewhere in the 8th century BC. And so due to this dispute of authorship, whether or not Jonah actually wrote it, or maybe he wrote down notes and then conveyed the whole story to somebody else, or however that worked, it could have been later or earlier, but we do know that it was going to be somewhere around the 8th century BC is what we're looking at date. And I think it's important, too, to kind of know historically what's the situation going on around the book of Jonah. And so there's a few things that are good to know that kind of give us an understanding of the Ninevites, why it was such an opportune time for God to send a prophet to the Ninevites. First, it was a time of great optimism for the northern kingdom of Israel. Things were going really well. The Assyrian Empire was on the decline. Israel was on the incline, and so they were regaining territory back. They were becoming powerful again. Economic prosperity was happening, and so really good things were happening for Israel. And so these kind of surrounding countries or people groups was a good opportunity for prophets to go in and give them hope, and give them something to hope in. And so, like I said, the Ninevites were in that opportune situation for the message of the Lord to be relevant in their current predicament. And so that's where Jonah comes in. Jonah was the son of, I'm going to butcher this, but it was Amittai. And he was called, of course, to prophesy to the Ninevites. And so this kind of gives us an understanding of historical context, date, authorship, and situation. Let's kind of dive into literary context. Let's look at the outline first, which I think is important. So we'll look literary here, and we'll go into the outline. And so I kind of define it as three parts, major parts of the book of Jonah. I think there's the first calling, the second calling, and then the response. And we're going to be looking specifically at the response. But what are some things that kind of happen through the book? In this first calling, we of course have Jonah's call, and then we have his temper tantrum and his refusal, and he escapes, or he attempts to escape, jumps in the boat, things go wrong, throw him overboard, big fish eats him up, right? And then Jonah's rescued by God, spit out onto the shore. Jonah responds with the heart of a prophet in thanksgiving, which I think is a really interesting part of Jonah, because I think we look to the very negative parts of Jonah, but there was a heart that was sincere in his love for his Creator. It's the other part, which we'll look to later, these older brother tendencies that were even kind of pouring out of him. And so that was the first calling. Then we jump to the second calling. Jonah finally accepts it, reluctantly, but he accepts it. Nineveh hears the message, opportune moment, they repent, and then God relents. And he takes away judgment off the Ninevites. And then thirdly is the response. And I specifically have it labeled in here Jonah's response, but I think it's Jonah's response and God's response, both equally important. Jonah, of course, becomes angry with God. God gives the object lesson with the tree, and then he poses this final question to Jonah. And that's kind of how the book closes. And we'll kind of get to that abrupt ending when we get to older brother Jonah here in this next section. But before we do, let's have somebody read the Jonah passage. And we'll kind of look at a little bit of a word study. Kind of look at some Greek here and kind of figure out how is this all going to tie back to Luke. And so, if somebody can read Jonah chapter 3, verse 10 through chapter 4, verse 3. Okay.
When God saw their deeds, that they turned from their wicked way, then God relented concerning the calamity which he had declared he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. But it greatly displeased Jonah, and he became angry. And he prayed to the Lord and said, Please, Lord, was not this what I said while I was still in my own country? Therefore, in order to forestall this, I fled to Tarshish, for I knew that thou art a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, and one who relents concerning calamity. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for death is better to me than life.
Okay. And so, we have a word in there. It's, I think yours was abounding in loving kindness. Mine says abounding in steadfast love. But if you kind of look, originally you have this word abounding. And then you have the small word in between in. But then the other big word is love. And so when you take these two words, this is going to help us kind of get to the core of why was Jonah so frustrated, and then as we jump here in Luke here in a bit, kind of the older brother's frustration as well. So abounding in love comes from two words. Abounding, it would be Rob or Rav. There's kind of many, great, much, long, enough, a multitude, kind of these words that are pulling this concept of a lot or much of something. And then this is the one I'm really going to butcher, but it's Sheked, Keshed. And this is this concept of mercy. And so this kind of, when you pull this word abounding in love and you break it apart, it really pulls this idea of much mercy. And so God is not just merciful, but He is abundantly merciful. And this is what's driving God, even in the midst of the Ninevites' rebellion, even in the midst of the Ninevites' continual year after year after year turning away from God. His abundant mercy is looking to penetrate their hearts. And this will pull us into this next section as we start looking at the heart of Jonah and, like I said, the heart of the older brother. And so, the expanded content on both of those, which I think is really relevant, is one, through a very reluctant prophet, God shows compassion for one of Israel's hated enemies. And I think you make that relevant for us of God shows compassion not just on Jews, not just on those who are really righteous, not just on those who have grown up in the church, but over all of creation. There's an opportunity for compassion and mercy. And then also through a very reluctant prophet, God shows compassion for the prophet as well. And it makes it very individualistic. It makes it where God, yes, shows mercy over all, but he also penetrates to the individuals and he shows mercy for his own creation one by one. And so there's this really cool context we get from abounding in love, much mercy shed upon all of creation and directly to the hearts of every creation. And so really cool content there. And so now let's kind of move. We've kind of done the historical context, the literary context, and we've kind of dove into the central piece of where we're going to go as we start kind of connecting Old and New Testament, Jonah chapter 3 to Luke chapter 15. So let's have somebody read and remind us of the end of the prodigal son story, Luke 15, 25 through 31.
Okay. Oh,
You got it.
okay. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of his servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him." "My son," the father said, "you are always with me and everything I have is yours."
Okay. And so, thanks for reading. This kind of next part is the connection. And I thought what would be helpful is if we kind of look at Jonah, older brother. It would be helpful if I kind of screw it here. And then look at younger brother and Ninevites. And kind of just see if we can't find some similarities, some things that kind of stick out. So let's start with Jonah and older brother. Is there anything that kind of sticks out to you about these two individuals?
They both feel like God owes them something.
Okay, good. God owes.
Or in the case of the older brother, the father owes him something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We'll put father here. It being a parable interchanging, but definitely the father in the actual story. Anything else that you notice about them? I mean, this is the big one. But there's probably other things you can pull from this concept of God owing, how you see them conducting themselves with the Father.
They both wanted justice
Okay, yeah.
over mercy.
Justice over mercy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's good. Anything else?
I think they were both like jealous. Like Jonah was jealous that the Ninevites got mercy, and the older brother was jealous of the younger one.
And that kind of goes a lot. I mean, jealous of what the Ninevites were about to get. Jealous about what the younger brother is getting with the fattened calf. Jealous of how God was reacting to each. Father was reacting. So yeah, a lot of jealous tendencies brewing there. It's good. Anything else? before we move on to the younger brother and Ninevites? Let's look at younger brother and Ninevites. What sticks out to you as similarities there? It's different because you're looking at a people and a person. But I think if you're looking at it through the eyes of Jonah, the older brother, you get very similar pictures between the two.
Well, both of them were considered to be lost.
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to throw the word broken at the end there too. So there's the big one. And the other small ones that you can kind of pull over with younger brother and Ninevites.
God has mercy on them.
Okay, good. Yeah, they both received mercy. So there's one really good one, and I'm not sure it's going to stick out because it's kind of like an underlining message in each, but each were culturally here. You don't see it in the story. I mean, I'll say it first. Each were dependent on either Jonah or the older brother. Now, Jonah, you see it because God was calling Jonah to prophesy to them. But culturally, it was actually the older brother's responsibility to go out and get the younger brother. You don't see that in the story, but both were somewhat, I don't like the word reliant because the father still was able to get to the younger brother without the older brother doing his duty. But if you're looking culturally, the way it was supposed to happen, both were dependent. Both were dependent. Or relying, I guess, maybe is a better word. And so you've got some, you've got some really cool pictures here of how these two stories are tying together. And so let me just summarize as we've kind of done, broken it down, but just recalling both stories. Remember, Jonah was called as a prophet. He was called to go and to give a message and to pull the Ninevites, who were lost and broken, back to a place where they could receive a message and repent, and then God would relent. Very similar here, the younger brother leaves and he flees and he takes what he feels is his from the father, and the relationship he had was simply to get what he needed or get what he wanted. And it was the older brother's responsibility culturally to go and chase after the younger brother, bring the younger brother home. And in the instance, the older brother didn't do it. When the younger brother still came home, just as the Ninevites did, they had to receive the message first. But once the younger brother came home, he still received mercy. And so there's this really cool picture here. And the two I really want to look at is Jonah and the older brother. Because I think we can really dive a little deeper and look into our own hearts, and we can really pull some things out. Before we do that, I want to show you a video. This is from Les Mis. It's a really cool scene. It's one of my favorite scenes in any movie. I think I cry every time during this scene because I just see Jesus in the priest. It's this really cool moment. Has anybody seen this movie? Okay, so it's this really cool moment of when Jean-Claude, I think is his name, he has just been released from prison for, I think, stealing a goat. This is in France. It's kind of right on the heels of the French Revolution, and times were really hard in France, and he stole a goat for food, ended up having to be in prison. He got his release papers, but he was on bail, so he had to go back to a place every so many months. And so he's trying to stay in this area, but when they release you, they don't give you anything. You've lost everything. So he's sleeping next to this church, and the scene that happens right before this, he's sleeping next to this church, and the priest comes up to him. He's in, clothes are all torn. He hadn't eaten in days. His beard has grown. It's really cold outside. It's snowing. probably wasn't even going to make it through the night. The priest comes in. Of course, it's all singing, so there's no talking. But he sings this kind of message of, come in, let me feed you, gives him food, gives him a warm bed. Well, he eats out of silver, this is a Catholic church, and so he eats out of silver platters and silver cups and silver servingware. And when the priest and the nuns go to bed, he puts it on a bag and he runs away with it. And so he was given mercy, and he was given things, and then he takes them and he runs with them. And then this is the next scene.
The lights, Joe.
Okay.
All right, so minus the part of the priest actually being the one who saves his soul for God. The message that comes out of that is this kind of concept of, he was given something, he ran with it, sure, but there's this very simple message of, doesn't matter how bad you've been or how many wrong things you've done, or this idea of how lost and broken that you actually are, that God's much mercy, His abundant mercy is enough, and it comes to you in those times. And just as the priest, I think, just as the older brother, and just as Jonah are this beautiful representation of Jesus, as we jump to the gospel now, and we really begin to make it relevant for us. There's this beautiful picture of God, of God sending somebody to be the messenger, sending someone to come into our lostness and our brokenness, and it ends with this beautiful picture of, we get it in Luke, of we were once lost, but now we're found. We were once dead, but now we're alive. As God describes the younger brother coming home. And so these really cool comparison as we look at the book of Jonah, and Jonah's just frustration of God's abundant mercy and God's much mercy being shed on those who he thinks deserve justice, who are jealous for what what they're about to get, who Jonah feels like, if anybody's going to get mercy, it should be me. Very similar to the older brother. And God simply just looks at him and says, you know what, just as he did to the older brother, everything I have is already yours. I've already given you the mercy. I've already covered you, and it's been done. And now I want to do the same for those who are still lost and broken. And so there's this really cool tie here, and I think that this scene kind of helps us understand Jonah and the younger brother a little bit better there. And so now what I'd like to do is, so we can dig a little bit more and see it more than just in Jonah and the prodigal son story, I want to let you take about 10 minutes, and I want you maybe in groups of 2 to look through Scripture and give me 5 to 8 other references of God's heart of mercy and compassion, whether it be for an individual, whether it be for people, And what would really be good is if you could find it where it came at a maybe an odd time, or somebody kind of like Jonah was resisting it, or somebody was standing in the way of it. And you can find these in Old Testament and New Testament. There's a plethora of them, of course. But go ahead and write some of those down. Or just keep some of them in your head, and then we'll come together. We'll pull these references. We'll kind of look at the heart of God a little bit more intimately, and then we'll do a creative prayer to kind of end where we begin to reflect more personally as we close. So I'll let you do that for about 10 minutes, maybe just one or two of you together, and then we'll come back together in about 10 minutes.
Is it 5 to 8?
Yeah, 5 will probably do it in 10 minutes.
What are we looking?
pull some of these together. Let's go ahead and just start with this group, and we'll take one or two, and then we'll see how many develop or if they do. So let's go one. Okay.
In Exodus 33:19, the Lord is speaking to Moses and talking about whom He will have mercy on.
Awesome. You got one more?
That was the John one.
Okay. Numbers 21:4-9, about the bronze serpent, maybe that they had to look at it or something.
All right.
Okay. One of them was in Genesis 18.
32.
Is kind of summed up in 32, where God is asking if you can just find 50 people, 40 people, 30 people, 20 people, and He says He will not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah.
Good. Sodom and Gomorrah and Abraham's story there. Good. I got one more back there.
What was the one? Peter?
Yeah, that was John. No, it was John.
Oh, in John 21:15-25, when Jesus forgave Peter after Peter had denied Him.
That's a good one.
We had Jesus and the adulteress.
Mm-hmm.
Lady brought to him. He chose not to stone her, but forgave her.
Where'd you find that? Remember that?
20.
John 8. And then Psalm 51, David begs the Lord to forgive him of his sin with Bathsheba.
Awesome. So I know y'all probably got a lot more, but these are good. Pull out maybe one or two of them here. Like the Jesus forgave Peter one. I love that because Peter was actually the one who denied Him. Peter was the one who was almost a little bit like the younger brother, right? Understood the Father, understood His love, and then kind of went in his own direction in a way. Very small tie there, but then there's this understanding that God's abundant love or His much mercy came back and covered Peter's kind of stupidity there, which is great. And of course, anytime Jesus approaches somebody who's a sinner, whether it be a prostitute, adulterer, all of these situations, Jesus comes about it with this understanding of I love Ephesians 4:15, this idea of speaking truth in love. So he's still coming with this much mercy, this overabundant compassion. And this one's really good because David is kind of similar to Peter here. David has been blessed upon blessed upon blessed, and he takes his own moment to go his own way. Of course, we know what happens in the whole David Bathsheba story. But in Psalm 51, I mean, he's kind of taking the opposite role where he's kind of the one pleading for his own self. And God still comes about him with this abundant compassion, this much mercy. And so I think it's a healthy understanding that when we look at the story of Jonah and we look at this concept of much mercy and how God, either in the midst of our over-righteousness or in the midst of our complete brokenness, God approaches us with this much mercy. And I go back to these two kind of expanded contexts that I've said is, though a very reluctant prophet, through a very reluctant prophet, God showed compassion for one of Israel's most hated enemies. So there's the rebellious aspect, the completely broken. He still shows compassion. But then you've also got, through the very reluctant prophet, God has an opportunity to show compassion on His own, on His prophet, on His over-righteous kind of arrogant prophet here, right? And I think it's cool because even when you tie to the end of the prodigal son story, Jesus is primarily speaking to who? He's speaking to his prophets. He's speaking still to his most religious leaders. He's speaking to the scribes and the Pharisees who, in all of their right mind, have the right to, I think on here, to see justice over mercy. Because that's very much the Old Testament law, right? But then there's this understanding that God's much mercy and his compassion through the centerpiece of the gospel, Jesus, has come to, whether it be in your complete righteousness or in your complete brokenness, come and penetrate. And so, to close, I always like to close, how do we respond? How do we reflect? So, no live music or anything, I'm going to whip out a guitar. But I wanted to do a creative prayer station. And so, we're going to kind of make our way into the kitchen, and then I'll kind of explain what we're going to do to close, and then we'll pray and be done. All right, so we get to get a little messy. This would be much more effective if it was like I had like prayer station set up for each of you, and you could go in your own little corner with candles and some worship music playing. But this will work. So this works best with sand, but we're going to use powdered sugar. And what it is kind of this reflective moment. So it might be an opportunity for you to find a place before you come to the pan, because it will be kind of awkward, I think, if you just kind of make our way around and we write something, somewhat personal about our heart on the pan. But as you reflect on Jonah, and as you reflect on the older brother and their tendencies as being righteous and wanting justice over mercy and wanting what was owed to them, and missing God's much mercy, missing God's overzealous compassion, right? Missing a key component of God's heart. What part of the older brother and what part of Jonah do you find in your heart? And that's kind of what I want you to reflect on. I want you to reflect on what over righteousness do you find that begins to seep up as God calls you to approach somebody who's lost, or have a conversation with somebody who has been involved in something that you would never do, or you would never be a part of, or talked about something in a certain way, or we could come up with tons of different illustrations here. But what happens when you approach somebody who's unrighteous? How does your righteousness get in the way of being loving and being merciful as the heart of God is? And so, this is definitely not to say there's not a place or a time for justice. It's definitely not to say that God doesn't have a just part of who he is, because he is. A part of him is just. But as we approach a lost world, and we're called by the gospel to approach it the way in which God does, compassion should be at the forefront of how we approach the lost world. And so, maybe it is you find yourself a moment and you just kind of want to reflect, and then kind of one at a time as you kind of find it. Just walk up to the pan and you just write. And so, I'll give you an example. Maybe it's pride gets in the way, so it's not going to work as well as sand. And then you take a moment to look at it and you reflect on your heart, maybe a quick prayer, and then as God does, just kind of let God forgive you for those thoughts, and then take your rag and wipe your hands off, and then we'll head back in there and we'll close by a small summary and praying together. So I'll let you take your moments. All right, so we'll just summarize real quick. We first studied together through the book of Jonah. We looked at the author, the date, historical context, and literary context as kind of our foundation as we began. And then we made a connection between Jonah and the prodigal son story, specifically between Jonah and the older son, the younger son, and the Ninevites, and began to pull applications from that on both the heart of a righteous man who believes his righteousness is kind of his foundation, and then the comparison between the lost son and the Ninevites of kind of the heart of the broken and how God approaches them in much mercy. And then finally we reflected on God's heart for the lost and broken, and we, by looking first at Scripture and then our own heart, and we applied these truths by examining them side by side with our own heart. So awesome. I appreciate y'all helping me out. Want me to pray for us? I know we'll be done. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for who you are. Thank you, God, that you're a God of much mercy. And God, though you are just, equally just as you are loving, Father, in our brokenness, you approach us in compassion. And God, we are so grateful for that. And it seems to be what happens is as we're approached with compassion, we forget that compassion should flow from who we are as believers, because the gospel is not just what saves us, it should be what keeps us. And it should be constantly changing who we are and changing the heart that was once lost, and not letting it become righteous, but letting it become compassionate. And so, Father, I just pray as we here in this room, believers, Father, that you would challenge our hearts not to approach a lost world with an overabundance of righteousness, but with compassion. And so, Father, we pray this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
You say bye-bye?
Say bye-bye. Say bye-bye to Mama.